In 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 1 to 5, Paul uses the church in Macedonia as an example of outstanding generosity. The first thing I'd like us to know about the Macedonian churches is that they faced severe trials. They did not have it easy. They had hard times. They went through difficult moments. They did not have things flowing their way all the time. They had difficult moments. I would like us to look at verse 1 and 2 of 2 Corinthians chapter 8. Verse 1, and now, brothers, we want you to know about the grace that God has given the Macedonian churches. Out of the most severe trial, the overflowing joy and the extreme poverty welled up in rich generosity. So they went through severe trials. We do not know for sure what kind of trials they were going through. They were probably persecuted. They were probably ostracized by the society around them because of their faith. Maybe they had severe famine in the area. But this did not stop them from being examples in generosity. No, they continue to be generous. Friends, I would like us to know that generosity has nothing to do with being comfortable. One can still give even when faced with severe trials. One can still be generous even when things are not working well for them in their business or in their place of work. One can still be generous even when they are going through hard economic times, because the example of the churches in Macedonia teach us that though they were going through severe trials, they still practiced generosity. The second thing I would like us to know about the Macedonian churches is that they faced extreme poverty, and yet they still practiced generosity. How amazing. This is what we read again in verse 2 of 2 Corinthians 8. Out of the most severe trial, the overflowing joy and the extreme poverty welled up in rich generosity. As much as they were extremely poor, they still reached out and overcame the challenge of their poverty and gave and shared. They were generous. Dear ones, generosity has nothing to do with having abundance. To the contrary, it has everything to do with a heart that is big enough to share the little resources that God has entrusted to you. Here are a few things that I believe made the generosity of the Macedonian churches outstanding. The first one is that they gave generously. This is what we read in verse 2 of 2 Corinthians 8. Out of the most severe trial, the overflowing joy and the extreme poverty welled up in rich generosity. Rich generosity. It wasn't just generosity, but rich generosity. They gave generously. As poor as they were materially, I believe they were so rich in their generosity that it stood out. Friend, are you generous? Are you generous when it comes to supporting God's work? Are you generous when it comes to giving to support others? Maybe a relative, maybe a friend, maybe somebody you do not even know. The Lord would have us be generous givers to support His work and to support others around us. Well, apart from giving generously, the Macedonians were outstanding in their giving because they also gave joyfully. Friends, giving should be an act of joy. And in 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 2, this is what we read. Out of the most severe trials, their overflowing joy joy. And their extreme poverty welled up in rich generosity. They were overflowing with joy. God loves a cheerful giver. We read of that in 2 Corinthians chapter 9 and verse 7. And when you get to a point where you feel you are being manipulated into giving, into being generous, please don't give in. Another reason why the generosity of the Macedonians stood out is because they gave willingly. This is what we read in the last part of verse 3 and in verse 4 of 2 Corinthians chapter 8. Entirely on their own, they urgently pleaded with us for the privilege of sharing in this service to the saints. Entirely on their own, out of their own volition, the Macedonians plead with Paul and say, hey, Paul, we are willing to support other saints. We are willing, Paul, as much as we are facing severe trials, as much as we are faced with extreme poverty, Paul, do not deny us the privilege of supporting other saints. Do not deny us the privilege of partaking in supporting God's work. Do not refuse our gifts, our generosity. They are pleading with Paul. They didn't consider giving a burden. They didn't consider it as a duty. They counted it as a privilege and were willing. Dear friends, generosity has nothing to do with being coerced. It has nothing to do with being pressured. You need to do it willingly. Yes, the generosity of the Macedonians was outstanding because they gave generously, they gave joyfully, they gave willingly, and lastly, they gave sacrificially. This is what we read in verse 3 of 2 Corinthians chapter 8. For I testify that they gave as much as they were able, and even beyond their ability. I like that. Their giving was outstanding not because of its size, but because they gave beyond their ability. And friends, we need to think about giving and supporting God's work sacrificially. Not just what we can afford, what we are able to, but going a little bit beyond that. The Lord would have us be people who give generously, joyfully, willingly, and sacrificially.